Hi guys, today I'm going to be making a whole wheat pizza dough from some pretty simple ingredients. I've got 1.5 cups warm water. It's about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I've got a tablespoon of dry active baker's yeast. I've got about a teaspoon of salt, some sugar, a tablespoon of olive oil, and I've got this flour mixture here that's 2 cups whole wheat flour and with 1 cup all-purpose flour. Normally whole wheat flours will give you finished baked goods that are pretty dense, so I kind of cut it with half of the amount of unbleached flour just to lighten it up a little bit. So the first thing we're going to do is take the warm water. You're going to put a teaspoon of sugar in. So we'll get that in there. Kind of stir it around to let it dissolve for a second. Okay, so then we're going to add the baker's yeast over the top of this mixture, because we need the yeast to start to ferment a little bit. So we're going to let it sit for about 10 minutes until it gets nice and foamy. What's going to happen here is the yeast is going to kind of feed on the sugar and the water, and it's going to break down the carbohydrates in the sugar into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is what the yeast is going to look like after sitting for about 10 minutes. It's kind of foamy at the top because you've got all these carbon dioxide bubbles. So we're going to add our salt, and that's about a teaspoon of salt. And in this recipe, the salt is going to affect the elasticity of the dough. It's going to make it less sticky. And it's also going to actually slow down the sugar consumption of the yeast. And it's going to create a more consistent fermentation. It's also going to add some flavor. So we're going to stir that together. And we're going to add that to our mixing bowl. So then to that, we're going to add our flour mixture. Right, and when we're going to keep mixing. So this is going to be where the gluten forms and the flour and water are coming together under the right conditions. And the gluten proteins in the flour, gliadin and glutenin, they are forming disulfide bonds and linking up end to end. So they're going to be forming these little spring-like coils. And this is going to be what gives our dough its elasticity and makes it stretchy. So it's going to be able to capture those carbon dioxide bubbles that were being released from the fermentation of the yeast. So we keep on stirring. Okay, so once your dough starts to come together, you're going to sprinkle some flour on your nice clean workspace. And you're going to knead the dough for about 10 minutes, which we're going to fast forward through in this video for the sake of time. But basically when you're kneading the dough, those disulfide bonds that the gluten proteins were forming, you're pretty much just strengthening them. And this kneading is going to help your dough become really elastic and stretchy. The longer you knead it, the stretchier it's going to get. And you want a dough that's very elastic and stretchy so it can stretch to capture those air bubbles being released, the CO2 bubbles that the fermentation of the yeast is releasing. And this is going to allow your crust to rise, and it's really going to help with the density and the texture. So once you've kneaded your dough for about 10 minutes, you're going to have a nice, smooth ball of pizza dough. We also know that since we're using whole wheat flour, we're going to have a nice flexible gluten, or we should at least, since whole wheat flours have much higher gluten protein levels in them. Okay, so once you have your ball, you're going to put it into a greased pan. I used just regular cooking spray for this. You're going to put the dough in, and you're going to kind of turn it so it coats. We're going to let our dough sit for about 45 minutes. this will allow the protein molecules in the dough that are all bunched together to become more uniform and aligned while it relaxes. It's going to make the dough more workable in the end. And when we let it sit, it's going to rise because you're going to have your gluten capturing all of those CO2 bubbles from the fermentation of the yeast. And this is also going to give it a chance to leave in the dough and once again help with the texture and the density. The cooking spray is just to keep the dough from drying out, and we're going to put a towel over it just to keep the air out, because if you let air in, it'll form a little crust. And we're just going to let it sit in a nice warm place for about 45 minutes. Okay, so after your dough has sat for about 45 minutes, you're going to take the towel off and realize that your dough has basically doubled in size due to the carbon dioxide bubbles that are being released by the fermentation of the yeast. And so as these bubbles are being released, they're being captured by the glutenin and trapped, and so the glutenin is stretching and expanding in order to capture those air bubbles without breaking. So your bread rises. So for the sake of time, I fast forwarded through my next step, which is to roll out the pizza dough. I broke the dough into 2 pieces, since this dough will give you enough for 2 thin crust pizzas. So I've rolled it out nice and thin, and now we're going to place it on my greased pizza pan. So after you place your dough on your baking pan, you're going to cut off the excess around the edges, and we're going to transfer this to our preheated oven, which has been preheated at 420 degrees. So we're going to let that bake for about 15 to 20 minutes, and it's going to be during this stage that the crust is going to rise a little bit due to the gluten capturing the air bubbles that are being released by the yeast. It's going to give it that nice, chewy, dense texture that we want in our pizza dough. Alright, now that we've waited about 20 minutes, we're going to go ahead and take our pizza crust out of the oven. Ooh, looks good. Alright, well, it looks like the gluten and the yeast did their job. We've got some nice air pockets in here. It looks like the dough's risen a little bit. Got a nice, crispy, golden brown, thin crust. So now you guys are going to be all set to top it with your favorite toppings. I personally am going to make a barbecue chicken pizza because that's my favorite, but that's all I got for you guys today, so thanks for watching.